One of the questions I hear a lot from people is, who pays the closing costs when you're selling a home? I've definitely had people reach out and say, well, I don't have to pay closing costs because I'm selling the home. The buyer pays closing costs, right? But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So closing costs are fees and expenses that are associated with the sale of a home. They typically range from 2 to 5% of the total sales price, and they cover various expenses like loan processing, title insurance, appraisals, real estate compensation. For me, I usually estimate it at about closer to 2%. That seems to be much more common with the people I work with. And one of the most common questions asked by a seller is, who pays for the closing costs when you're selling a home? And in a traditional real estate transaction, both the buyer and the seller have their own set of closing costs to pay. I think that's something that people don't always understand. And I think they maybe do it differently in other states. I've had people from Hawaii tell me like, wait, what? The seller has to, or the buyer has to pay closing costs? I thought the seller did that. So in Utah, each side has closing costs. However, the question who pays for what can be negotiated between the two parties and may vary depending on state and local laws. In some cases, sellers are willing to offer some money to help their buyer with closing costs, and that's usually when we're in more of a buyer's market. Generally, the buyer is responsible for paying the majority of the closing costs, and the seller is responsible for paying a few specific fees. So let's talk about a breakdown of those common closing costs and who typically pays for each. First, we have the real estate advisor compensation. That compensation is typically the largest closing cost for the seller, no doubt. So the standard commission is unknown. It's kind of whatever you want it to be, but it's not uncommon for it to be anywhere from 3 to 6% of the total sales price. But this is negotiable between the seller and the listing agent. So in some cases, the buyer's agent may also receive a portion of that commission from the seller, sometimes not, sometimes it comes from the buyer. Watch my previous video, we just went through all that. The next thing is going to be transfer taxes and recording fees. So you have transfer taxes and recording fees that are charged by the government to transfer the title of the property from the seller to the buyer. And these fees are usually split between the buyer and the seller, although state and local laws may dictate who is responsible for paying them. Then you have title insurance. Title insurance protects the buyer and the lender from any legal disputes or defects in the title of the property. So in lots of cases, the seller is responsible for paying the buyer's title insurance policy. That's very, very common in Utah. Next thing would be attorney's fees. If you're in Utah, you can pretty much ignore this. We don't do our closings with attorneys, but in some states they use attorneys. And you might be consulting an attorney because you have a very complicated transaction happening. You want to be sure that there aren't any legal encumbrances, or you have legal questions about how it'll affect your portfolio, that kind of thing. So in some states, it's customary for the seller to cover the cost of hiring an attorney to handle the closing. However, that can be negotiated between the two parties, buyer and seller. Next would be home warranty. A home warranty is an optional expense that the seller might choose to provide for the buyer. Often, when it's more of a buyer's market, sellers do that to attract buyers and just show them. It's kind of an act of goodwill to show the buyer that your property is covered for a year after you buy it if anything does happen to malfunction, that kind of thing. And usually in Utah, it's $500 to $700. I feel like the cost has been going up recently over the last few years. I guess everything's been going up since, COVID. But it covers the repair or replacement of major appliances and systems within the home for a specific period of time. Usually a year. You can do 2 or 3 years, and it usually costs, double or triple the amount. And the seller typically pays for home warranty, but not always. If it's an extreme seller's market, buyers don't even ask for a home warranty, or they pay for it themselves. It can also be negotiated to be split as a cost between the buyer and the seller. The last thing is going to be outstanding liens and judgments. So before the sale can be completed, the seller has to clear any of those outstanding liens and judgments on the title of the property. And these are typically paid by the seller before the closing. Well, I guess that makes me think of one other thing. So one last thing would be loan payoff fees. So if the seller has a mortgage on the property, there are going to be fees associated with paying off the loan before the closing. And those fees are usually deducted from the sale proceeds. So it's important for both the buyer and the seller to have a clear understanding of who is responsible for paying the closing costs before entering into a sales contract. Always keep that in mind, that there are going to be about 2% closing costs for both sides. So it's going to be something that can be negotiated during the offer or in the counter offering process, but it's also a good idea for both parties to review the closing cost estimate provided by the lender or sometimes their agent gives it to them to ensure accuracy and to avoid any surprises on the day of closing. Ultimately, the responsibility for paying the closing costs when selling a home falls on the seller, with a few exceptions in specific fees that might be negotiated or be required by state or local laws. Sellers should carefully consider these costs when determining the asking price for their home to ensure that they can cover those expenses and still make a profit. Definitely keep that in mind. If you've been thinking about selling your home or you have more questions about this, feel free to reach out. I would love to walk you through it. Thank you so much for watching.